welcome to our first panel. We're very excited. I'm sure we're all slightly or very close to burning out at this point in December. So very appropriate topic, unless we all want to take a nap during this hour. And hopefully you'll get to learn some cool things. And we'd love to hear from you. So just write your questions in the chat. We'll leave a few minutes at the end for questions and stuff. So first, before we begin, microphones muted for whoever is not speaking. We are recording the session and we'll provide you with the recording afterwards. And again, if you have any questions in the chat, and we'll address them in the last 10 minutes or so. So we are here to talk about burnout during the holidays where we are now and beyond, because this is definitely not just a December factor, even though I would really like for all of us to take December off from now on. We have myself and Christina, and you all know me, so I shouldn't have to introduce myself. Alex Collimore, who will be our facilitator, and he's also my business partner and co-host on our podcast. Sean Daly, he is our guest from temporarily the East Coast, and I'll let him introduce himself. And we have Jennifer Pinter, who's also our panelist from right here in Colorado. So Sean and Jennifer and Alex, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sounds good. So as Christina said, I'm Alex. I'm just I co-founded Siamo with Christina, and I'm here to just help run this panel, and we can go through some of the burnout topics. Christina and I started this company on human-centered workplace a little while back, and this is our first panels to go talk about one of the most human things happening right now, burnout. So with that, I will hand it over to Jennifer.
Hi, Jennifer Pinter here. I'm a senior engagement manager at a startup named Capta. Excited to be one of the panelists today and share some helpful tidbits about burnout.
Hello, I'm Sean Daly. I am Assistant Dean of Hospitality, or the College of Hospitality Management at Johnson & Wales University in Providence, Rhode Island currently. But I am from the Denver area, and my research expertise is in the organizational kind of behavior psychology area around leadership and employee interaction and the benefits or hangups of that.
Thank you, everyone. All right, questions we will cover today, and we may go on some tangents and get deeper on some items, because if any of you have listened to our podcast, that's how we roll. What does burnout mean to you? We're going to get a few definitions, both from the academic world and the human world. What is burnout? How can we recover from and prevent burnout? What are the main blockers you see in acknowledging and addressing burnout? How do you know when you've hit your limit? And when it comes to resolving burnout, what is responsible for the employee, and when is it the leader's responsibility? So let's go right ahead and start the questions.
All right, let's dive in. Actually, we're going to go straight to you, Sean, with the first one. What is burnout? What does it mean to you? And what's your definition? What's a definition?
Yeah, I'll say from a research scientist, kind of social scientist perspective, the World Health Organization cites burnout as a chronic workplace stress that's just unmanaged, and there's lots of indicators of that. However, I would challenge that to say that we don't live in a world where stress only happens from the workplace. I think stress comes from multiple sources, many sources, which I think we'll kind of unpack today. And but yes, not being able to manage or having a hard time managing all the variables of stress that are coming at you, whether it's family or outside of work obligations or work obligations, if that's not managed over time, can wear you out for sure.
Interesting. So it's more about like the management of stress. That's cool. Addition to the definitions, some of the definitions I've heard. Jennifer, what does burnout mean to you?
For me, burnout means that I've packed my schedule too full to allow myself time to breathe and have downtime, not enough time to relax or complete simple tasks like putting laundry away or getting through my email inbox. Burnout typically makes me feel like more irritable and maybe short with people, because you start getting kind of frustrated and tense. And most of the time you can see it in the way you're reacting to things. And it has a lot of mental stress, right?
Interesting. It's definitely it starts to come out when you realize you can't manage these things. Christina, let's follow up with you. What's your definition of burnout?
Definitely both of what Sean and Jennifer mentioned, the stress, the packing the schedule too much. And also I found the burnout for me, it's also disconnection from doing something that aligns with my values and doing something that allows me to feel valued as well. So it's not just a physical thing of too much going on, but it's also not doing enough of what I love and what I feel it's my purpose and mission in the world, and also what I feel appreciated for. So that does drive me to burnout.
That's one thing I heard recently from Adam Grant. He published an article a little while back about languishing, how we all have this kind of languishing feeling after the pandemic and going through this extended period of increased burnout. And that's one thing that it comes up a lot, is finding more meaningful work rather than necessarily always just taking breaks from work. And so that's an interesting viewpoint as well. And that kind of leads us right into it. And Christina, maybe you can kick us off on this one. Let's talk a little bit more about when can you acknowledge burnout, and how do you go about addressing it?
I usually acknowledge burnout the minute I realize I'm not in the present moment as much as I would like to be, or I usually notice if I'm snapping at the kids more quickly than normal. And so when things start piling up and I find myself reacting in a negative way, not listening, wanting to do a lot of things, that's when I start realizing like, oh, something is off. What's off? And that's when the burnout, that's where my limit is, whether it's through whether it's because of time, of having committed too much time, or because whatever time I'm committing to things, I'm feeling like I'm wasting.
That's interesting. Yeah, and so let's go with the acknowledging topic. So when do you feel it, Jennifer? When can you acknowledge that you're entering burnout?
Usually just if I have any kind of feeling of being overwhelmed with what's on my plate, then I know I've said yes to too many things or created timelines for myself that maybe were not feasible or necessary. I feel like a lot of times we kind of self-impose timelines on ourselves and without really thinking them through. It's like, oh yes, sure, I'll get that to you by tomorrow. And do we really need to do that? So typically anytime I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed and like I don't have time for things that bring me joy, then I realize that I need to take a step back and make some room and some space.
And Sean, what do you think?
I'll just add to that by saying, we all know about fight, flight, or freeze, right? And I think a great indicator of I'm overwhelmed, which is a precursor to I'm shutting down, which is a precursor to I'm burning out, right? So I would say that a really great kind of self-awareness, being understanding when you're overwhelmed, is kind of like the critical piece of that whole puzzle. And I know that I'm overwhelmed when I freeze. I'm just like, wait a second, there's so much going on that I can't actually decide which one to do. And my family's asking for this and my work's asking for this. And I also need a little bit of balance for myself in here as well. And now I've got children who they need me. I've got these things pulling for me, and then I snap and I get grumpy and I'm argumentative with my wife or whatever. And she's very quick to kind of point out, hey, like that's what's going on with you. And of course, sometimes I'm self-aware, sometimes I'm not, but that's definitely an indicator. And the little voice in the back of my head is saying, red flag, you are overwhelmed and you need to take a pause. So that's for me.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead, Walt.
So we talked about the red flags after it occurs. Are there ways, unless you guys talked about it because I was trying to watch, are there ways to kind of acknowledge it before it occurred, like try to get it beforehand? I think are there exercises or things like kind of mental check-in points on ourselves to do it before it reach that point, right? I think that's kind of how I'm trying. That's one of the things we could try to help ourselves, because if it gets too late, then the damage is already done. Like, how can we identify before it gets to that point?
We just recently compared this to hydration. Once you start feeling thirsty, it's already too late. Like you're already dehydrated. So that's a great question. I'm going to open that up to the panel. What do you guys think?
I'll just chime in and say self-awareness. I think that's the first step in recovery or preventing burnout, but that's also a really tough one thing to do. It's really tough to sit down and say, because you're trying to balance out expectations of all the different parties who need you to do certain things. And if you're not aware of what your tip is, because we know in the world of psychology that stress actually is a good thing for a lot of us, especially in athletes. They get hyper aware, they work harder, they play harder, they jump higher, they do everything better when they've got a little bit of adrenaline from stress in their body. But it quickly turns to competitive anxiety, and they get stuck and they can't do anymore. It's the same thing I think with employees. We have this kind of equilibrium where we're really doing really great, and then boom, we're terrible. And I think self-awareness is that kind of like, you're going to find this like a plus or minus in that equilibrium of whatever works for you. But I wish I could say, here's your magic worksheet and you can fill it out and it'll solve all your problems. But I don't think that's the way it works. I think some good, tough conversation with you. And I think we'll all agree that having people around you kind of give you their observation of you would be a great start.
As long as they're people you trust.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, for sure. Just to add to that, I think, the self-awareness thing for me, like I noticed that maybe my sleep starts to get impacted. Like I'm usually a really good sleeper. If I'm having trouble sleeping, usually that means there's something else going on and I'm stressed about something. My husband and I walk our dogs a lot and we'll talk about our days. And like, usually I can tell when he's had enough, and having somebody in your life that like knows you, that can be a sounding board. And sometimes they can be like, oh, it sounds like you have a lot going on. And I've had people say that to me before and go, oh, wow, I do have a lot going on. And I didn't even like recognize, like, because sometimes we're so busy doing and going through what's happening in our lives that we're like not actually cognizant of how much we're actually processing and dealing with. So I think sometimes it's helpful to have that person that you can talk to and then they can tell you, hey, by the way, that's a lot,
Good point, Jennifer.
Yeah, very good points. I like the physical indications. That's definitely a good first exercise. If we were to create that magic worksheet, I would say like thinking back in the past of our experiences of when we did burn out and recognizing what did I feel physically. A lot like Jennifer, I stopped sleeping. I sleep very badly at night, so that's an indication. I also have digestive issues, so like I'll feel nauseous a lot. And so now I know that those are my physical red flags. Our bodies respond to stress before our brain can figure out we are stressed. And even like my shoulders hurt, my neck hurts. So like any physical indication, it's like, oh wait, what's going on? And just by taking that pause of recognizing that something physical is off, then we can go through the exploration of why am I losing sleep? What am I thinking about when I'm losing sleep? What's happening, to my calendar? And then we can start looking at, am I scheduling myself too much? One of the things that helps a lot is looking ahead on the calendar and thinking, if realistically speaking, in the perfect world, if I can only handle 3 meetings a day and I have 7, what's going to happen if I do that over and over and over? Maybe I can do it for a week. Maybe I can do it for 5 days, but can I actually do it all the time? And so in jobs, sometimes we don't have the luxury to say no to meetings, but we'll also talk about setting those boundaries in this panel. But we could do something on the personal side. So maybe, I learned for my kids and my family, weekends are pretty much no plans. If we have one plan over the weekend, that's about as much as we can handle. And that's usually means the next weekend we try no plans, because otherwise our weeks become completely overwhelming.
I think there's a twofold to that. I really like what you said, Christina, especially about thinking back on times when it was happening, because usually it's hard to, we don't want to go back and think about the times we were burnt out. We tend to be glad that we're not burned out anymore. And so it's hard to go back and relook at the time when we were, but if we do, we can go start to find these patterns so that we can identify them a little more. So having some kind of reflective practice like a journal or something, going back and thinking about those times can help identify those ahead of time. And then there's also easy ways to do gut checks. Like if you look at your calendar of meetings for the week, and when you hit certain ones where you're like, oh god, that's not going to be good, like then you start to realize the patterns of what are you not looking forward to, what does give you energy versus what is almost assuredly going to be a drain. And those kind of self-reflection practices can help start to establish it so that when the patterns start building again, it's a little easier to catch them as they build instead of when they have spilled over.
If I can add one more thing, Alex, that you pointed out is I actually I did a journal a couple of years ago where every night I wrote down 3 things that energized me today, 3 things that drained my energy today, and what did I learn? And I did that for 60 days straight. The exercise is supposed to be 30 days, but I did it for 60. And when you start noticing that you're writing the same thing over and over and over on the draining the energy, that's when you're realizing those things burn me out. So how can I modify? What can I change there? And for me, besides the scheduling, it's also the values. If one of my biggest values is connecting with people, and I'm in a job where I can't talk to people because my job is supposed to be sit in the corner and work, I may be able to do that for a week, 2. I can't do that for 9 months. That's going to burn me out.
I have a question.
Sure.
So we've talked about like managing the things you have control over, but we know kind of with the way the last few years have gone, everyone's overworked, everyone's taking personal leave, layoffs are happening. So people are reevaluating, like you said, Alex, kind of what do I want? Do I want to stay? It's like being in a bad relationship with your employer because you're telling them what you need and not getting it in return, but that's out of your hands. So like how do you know? We can all do that self-assessment of this is where I'm at, this is where I want to be, where's my breaking point? But how can you manage when you start getting super stressed or overwhelmed or burnt out on things you have no control over? I think that's my hardest thing because I can be in control of myself, but all of these things are impacting your life and you don't have control over them.
That's an excellent question. You want to take a first stab?
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Yeah.
Those things that are outside of your control, are they like assigned tasks types things, or are they organizational system type things?
I mean, it could be just simple things like, I know the better you are at your job, the harder your projects are, or the more work you get, right? And you want to be a team player, but where's your breaking point? Like, when do I get a break? Or when and I've noticed, I just actually came back from leave and like half our team had quit. A ton of people were on leave. They were experiencing all these things and they decided to kind of wash their hands clean and start fresh for themselves. But evaluating when you're either not being heard or you've reached a breaking point. And I think that's when I get burnout, is when I'm disappointed from, people not doing the right thing, whether it's in a personal life or a business organizational structure, because you can't control them making the right choices for their people. And that's frustrating. And that's when I notice I'm burnt out, not just because I'm working a lot, but because that's out of your control, even if you say what's on your mind, right?
Yeah, and by the way, your dog is super cute.
Yes.
I can empathize with you. I actually experienced that many times, actually experiencing it kind of right now with my current employer. That there are definitely times where you, more is not better, and I think as a leadership developer, trainer, researcher type person, one of the first things that I impress or teach or force upon the people I'm working with is that the relationship they have with the people that they're working with is it's the keystone to everything. And that relationship builds trust, and that trust helps you feel safe to say, you are giving me too much. And for them to, more importantly, for them to recognize through things like body language, You've withdrawn at work. You used to be chatty, now you're not so chatty. Things of that nature that we can see, those behaviors that are red flags for leaders to say, oh, something's wrong with Danny. Like I need to check in with her. I need to check in with her. And those are the things that I would say are important for people that are managing you. But for you, again, we go back to self-awareness, but on top of that, feeling like you have the right to say, this is my boundary. And I've said it to my boss. Hey, look, I can do all this, but this is diminishing returns that you get, everything that you put on top of me. This is my sweet spot. Let's keep me in my sweet spot. Kind of educate them on how to work with me. I don't know. Those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand what what your zone of genius, like my boss always likes to say, are you in your zone of genius doing this? Is this what you like to do? Does this bring you joy? Like knowing what that is and being able to communicate it within your organization and with your manager is really important. And if you find yourself being in a situation where you know that the workload is too much and there's not really an end in sight and you're not being heard and it is kind of an organizational culture, then unfortunately at that time, it's important to look at what you need, right? And find a better fit, because I think sometimes we're also like, oh, I'm so happy to have a job and I'm so happy to be working. But at the same time, if you're burning yourself out, that's going to have repercussions in your work too, right? And the only way companies are going to learn and leaders are going to learn is if people are speaking up and saying, hey, we cannot continue to work like this, right? So I think it's really important having that honest communication about what you need and speaking up when you realize, like, because I think there used to be a point in time where it was like not okay to go to your boss and be like, hey, you're giving me too much work, right? Like we used to think that way, but it's actually better to say something and say, no, this, I have too much on my plate, right? We have such a hard time saying, no, I can't take care of everything. It's like in our human nature to be like, oh, I got this, no problem. You can rely on me. And then next thing you know, you're crying on Sunday because you feel overwhelmed, right?
Can I add to that a little bit? I think you brought the point of culture, which I think is an incredibly great rabbit hole for us to go down a little bit. Because some of these things, your whoever your direct report is, it may not be within their control. Like everything kind of falls down the ladder, right, to whomever gets the next piece of it. And I think considering what our culture looks like, the American ideal of the harder I work, the better I am, I mean, that's, yes, you get what you earn. That's not a bad mentality, but again, if an organization's culture, umbrella type culture, is designed around, if you're not working hard, then you don't belong here. And by hard, I mean, I'm going to send you an email on Sunday morning, and I know you might be going to church, but that's not important right now. Let's make sure you check in your email when you need to. Or those things like that. And so you're not getting any family time. You're not getting any you time. You're not getting anything you want to recharge those batteries. Eventually, burnout happens, the retention drops, and people quit. That's how these things work. So having that awareness of what the culture is, and maybe it's not a good fit for you. I mean, it's okay to say that too.
I would just piggyback on both of those ideas. I think that one thing that helps with setting boundaries is setting kind of a framework for what the boundary is for yourself. Like, what am I willing to do and what am I not willing to do? I'm 100% borrowing this, by the way, from our friend Emer, who wrote a course on this called The Elegant No, which I would totally recommend checking out. It's a great way of framework of creating boundaries. But the whole idea is figuring out what you're able to say yes to and no to, because that way you have, it feels less like, just coming out and being like, no, I won't work on that. I mean, that's important to say too. But if you know your parameters of what you're willing to work on, how many hours you're willing to work, when you're willing to work, it's easier to establish that and say that. And then to your point, Danny, when you asked the question, you talked about it being like a bad relationship with your employer. And at some point, relationships have to go both ways for it to work out. And so I think employers are learning that the hard way with the Great Resignation going on, that there has to be a little bit more give and take and understanding. And it definitely feels, especially for everybody who's feeling the end of 2 years of a pandemic, like it's not moving fast enough, but it has been some amount of movement in this realm. And there is a worthwhile evaluation to say, is this relationship still two-way? Is it still working for me?
Awesome.
I would definitely go ahead.
Yeah, it's just it's hard to not be frustrated about how people behave. It's like they wait until everybody quits or something bad happens to do something about it. And that's frustrating. And then you're like, why am I frustrated about this? Because I have no control over it. But we all see the future of what's going to happen, because if you're working hard and you got your hands in a lot of pot with the company, sorry, puppy, you see it and you can like predict the future and what's going to happen, and they don't do anything about it till something bad happens, like everyone quits or something else. And that's hard, because then you're like, I should not be frustrated about this. I can do something, I can leave, or I can speak up. But it's still, you have that sense of frustration that you've put a lot into something, and you might have to let it go. And those kinds of things add to burnout when you're already working so much as well. So that's something that I struggle with the most, like not just workload and balance and boundaries, but it's letting go of those frustrations with either an organization or a company that waits till something bad happens to make a change.
Definitely feel you on that one. That's definitely something that happens frequently. In fact, Christina coined a great phrase. Why do I have to give notice to get noticed?
Yes.
Why does it have to get bad for things to be acknowledged?
Which is what's been happening, and it's what's happening right now, is that it's like people are getting noticed because they're all giving notice. And I'm like, what if you notice people before you get to that point?
And this actually, Heather, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I did. I don't know if other workplaces are like us. I think we actually have a pretty good balance where we are, but I notice everywhere I've worked, there's this, and it's probably an American culture thing more than like a individual corporate culture. It's like a contest to see who's busier. Like you'll get in these conversations where someone will be like, I was up returning emails until 10 p.m. And then somebody else was like, yeah, but I got up and returned an email at 4 a.m. And somebody else was like, oh, I worked all week. Like, any good guidance on how to change that narrative instead of being part of that stupid discussion?
I have lots of strong opinions about this.
Go right ahead, Jennifer.
Oh man. I think it's really, really important to lead by example. I purposely do not respond to emails after hours. If someone messages me on Slack or whatever, I've learned the hard way, and I think we all have to learn the hard way, right? We've kind of talked about this, Christina and Alex and I before, about when you learn the hard way, it just really resonates with you, and you figure out where your limits are real quick. But I lead by example. So I don't send emails. I don't respond to emails. I don't respond to Slack messages after hours, unless it is literally like the world is burning down and I absolutely have to. I will acknowledge a message, but like, luckily I'm in a place that doesn't happen very often. The other thing that I think is really important is for company culture, and when you're interviewing and stuff, there's a lot of things that you can keep an eye out for to see what's important in that organization before you start working there, like when you're in the interview process. And I have a lot of suggestions about, if you find yourself in a situation and somebody's emailing you on the weekend, have a conversation with them. Say, hey, I try to keep my personal life separate. I try to take a mental break on the weekend, and I saw you emailed me, and set an expectation with them. Say, hey, are you just emailing this to get it off your plate, or were you expecting a response? So this happened to me at a past job. I had just started. My boss emailed me on Saturday, and I just left a job I had worked at for a very long time, because I burnt out and I was constantly working. I was working through the weekends, especially during the holidays, and it was just go, go, go. And I burnt myself out, and I learned the hard way. And I immediately asked my boss, I said, hey, did you expect me to respond to this? Are we going to be doing emails on the weekends? Is that a thing? Because I wasn't expecting to do that. And she was like, oh, no, sorry. And then she never emailed me on the weekend again. She just scheduled it. And so we set an expectation with each other that, like, hey, my weekends are my private personal time, and it's okay for me to not work on the weekends. That's not the expectation at our organization. So I think it's important to be clear and like have a conversation. And one last thing, I just heard from somebody that I'm really close with. They had an all hands meeting, and in the all hands meeting, the director or whatever recognized someone for how hard they worked and for working through their vacation. And I said, that is the problem right there. You just rewarded someone for working on their vacation. Like, you just told every 200 employee, all the 200 employees on an all hands meeting that, hey, this person did a great job because they worked through that is spreading that culture. And so if I were an employee at that company, I would say, hey, is this the expectation? Is this what we're getting rewarded for? If not, we should not be encouraging people to do that in an all hands meeting. Like, that's how people get burnt out. And guess what? People in this company are getting burnt out and they're leaving constantly. So if you promote that kind of behavior in your organization, that it's going to be not good.
No, but to Jennifer, to your point, that's typically what happens, right? Whoever's above you kind of sets the expectation of below, right? And I mean, I currently work for a wonderful woman who is hardworking and she's smart, she's good at what she does, but she works. I mean, nights and weekends and never takes a vacation, and I personally don't believe in that. Like, I leave work when I'm supposed to leave work, and I always say, like, quote, we're not saving lives here. And so it'll be there tomorrow morning. And but I also work very hard while I'm at work. There's no coffee talk, like no cooler talk for me. Like, I sit down, I work, I'm like, oh, I got to stand up, eat lunch, get out of the office for a second, then go back. But my mentality there is when I go home, I have to be super attentive to my family or myself, because I got to recharge my batteries. I have other things. And so I can't afford to be balancing all that. It's just not going to work. It's like juggling chainsaws. Eventually one cuts your arm off, And so I like
the image.
I know, right? But I'm saying to her all the time, hey, she was going to a conference today. I said, hey, you're going to a conference. That's great. Don't forget, we got this whole place. We're going to survive. This place is going to be here when you get back. Don't be afraid to unplug and just be present at the conference. And she's like, oh, I can't do that. And I was like, okay, but I'm going to,
Yeah.
So I think it's the personal decision. I love Jennifer's point about being kind of a lead by example person, because that's how culture kind of works. It's infectious, like it's a lot of it's unspoken. It's not necessarily in an employee manual. It's just kind of there. It's this is the way we've always done it conversation. And you have the opportunity to make it that way if you'd like it to be. The question is, the person above you, whether or not during some sort of employee review process, they're like, oh, Heather, she could do more. I feel like she could do more, and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm doing everything I possibly can. So I think that's where there's a conflict there.
Yeah.
So this is what I do.
Example. Sorry, go ahead.
So thanks, Al. No, so to echo what Jennifer's point about working crazy hours, I used to work crazy hours like our previous role, actually my current role, and it took I did a 360 review for myself, for my peers and my clients, and my clients were the one who were brutally honest with me. They're like, Kwong, you have the high threshold of work, but you have to say no. You have to set your boundaries, right? It wasn't my team, it was my manager, it was my clients that told me, hey, you need to set boundaries because XYZ. And this is for Danny. And so 360s are important. 360s, it's feedback, not just a different point of view within the organization. It'll tell you where you're at. It's mostly brutal honesty. And that helped me change my boundaries because I used to work crazy hours, and it was the work had to get done. And instead of saying no, I can't do this, it kind of reset my mindset. So that's also what helped me kind of change my mentality on how to kind of restrict. Hey, this is not necessary. There's no need to work at the weekends, and to push back on asking the manager, say, hey, you know what? If you email the weekends, do you want me to respond? These kind of conversations are not being had, honestly, within my organization, right? It's when within the talent part of the organization, which I support, which is great, but within other organization, no, it's not. So culture, as you say, Sean and Jennifer, it's kind of breeding, but it's lead by example, and that's the hard part. That's the hard part to kind of push because either you go in there trying to change the culture, or B, you just do as how normally is. So for me, 360 was very helpful for me.
So I love what you said about it being the client also that pointed that out, because we tend to feel the guilt and as if it's not going to serve the customers. And the customer is the one coming back to you saying that one too, rather than the culture itself, the company itself, which is telling you the customer is not going to like this. So that was especially interesting part of your 360 there. And there's a couple things I do want to note, and we have 20 minutes left, so I want to do a couple other questions. But first, I really like that, Kwong, that doing 360 is great to get that kind of feedback and from multiple sources. Jennifer, I really like your example of sending that email back of like, do you expect me to do this? Because that does create the conversation of the expectation, as well as reiterate, this is what you're saying. If you write an email late at night, are you expecting this? Because what the message that you're really sending is, I expect people to be working at this hour. So challenging that in a very graceful way helps release some of that stress. But before we get too out of time here, I would love to address kind of the big hairy beast in the room, and kind of the end of Danny's question. If you're feeling especially exhausted, if you've already entered burnout, what do we do to address this? How do we start resolving this? So I'd love it. Christina, maybe you want to start up on that one?
Sure, happy to. Well, the first piece is always awareness. So having the awareness of like, I am burnt out, and then looking at the situation. There's, something that comes up with what we just talked about as well, is like, there's a lot of shame that we have to face for ourselves, because the culture is working hard means working 24/7, means getting rewarded, means getting recognized. And it is changing by force with the Great Resignation more than anything else, but it's still there. There's a lot of, what are people going to say about me? I've been on the receiving end of people accusing me of not being one that wants to work hard because of their definition of working hard, which is putting up with a situation that was impossible. And that's not my definition of working hard. And so it took, coaching, it took working with someone to actually get past that shame. We have a lot of demons that unfortunately come up. And so when that awareness sets in, it's good because it's the first step. And then there's going to be a lot of work to be done to figure out what's next. How do I not fall back into the habit? Because there are habits that we have. And it's like, giving up chocolate every day for me. And I still haven't figured out how to do that. So even like, wanting to tell people how busy I am, it's almost like an addiction, because you're gonna get that reward on the other side. I'm like, oh my God, like that's wonderful. And I'm like, no, if I stop saying that, maybe I'll stop being addicted to the reward, the fake reward that I'm getting back. And so once we are aware of our burnout, I'm a big fan of find the help, find the support. Whether it's your significant other, whether it's a coach, both, neither, colleagues, whoever it is, but find the support to talk through things. Because we have a lot of things that once we actually say them out loud and we can see them out there, we realize like, oh, wait, that's worse than what I thought, or not as bad as what I thought. And I can actually resolve it, but they have to come out of our brains, because there's too much going on for us to just fix it all by ourselves.
Yeah, I'll add to that and say, when we talk about there's emotional intelligence and we talk about emotional agility, it's kind of like what you do with that emotional intelligence, how you handle it with tools. And I think one of the major pieces to that puzzle is kind of like understanding it and naming it, being able to say, oh, there it is, I see that. And that requires you to kind of change your lens and perspective on what you see from there's a little voice in the back of my head that says, oh, if you should feel shame, you should feel guilt about not doing this, to, hey, wait a second. If this is the new me, like, okay, I have to change the way I see work. I have to change the way I see my relationships with work. For me, I struggle. I mean, my mentors have always been workaholics, right? So just this perfect example. And for me, I was like, okay, well, that's the bar. That's how you do it. That's what a good person does. A good husband, father, American dream does. And then I quickly started to understand that it wasn't a 1-to-1 ratio. The harder you work, the more money, the happier you get. There's this line where hard work doesn't equal happiness anymore. And so it forced me to kind of change my lens on the values that I have around hard work. And gosh, if I'm working at work all day, I can't be an example for my kids on how to be hard work. All I'm showing them is how to not be home all the time. They don't see dad at like sledgehammer at work all day. They don't see that, right? They just see dad gone. And so it's important that I can show them that balance. So there's this whole other lens that I've decided to look at it. And it's not perfect. Don't get me wrong. It's not perfect. But that second piece of that is I try to associate, your parents always said, if you hang around with these kind of people, you're going to become these kind of people. Well, that could be negative or it could be positive. I associate with people at work that also believe in balance. I associate with people that my friends in my social circle at home also believe in balance. So you kind of get that kind of injection of support every time you're doubting it. And that really helps me.
So Danny, I want to, this is what I do at work. So I have mental check-ins with like 2 people that I trust. Like these are, one is a colleague, one is someone else. And I say, hey, what's your mental check-in on a level 1 to 10? And then they give me their values. And then when they see me like having my breaking point, they ask me, Kwong, what's your mental check-in? And so it kind of resets I'm like, okay, where am I really at? And then before I get to my breaking point, already back or I'm already past my breaking point, I kind of resets myself and where's my mental check-in. So we do this intermittently during a couple of months. It's just random for us, Danny. And so that helps me kind of like where it's reset. Where I'm at. Okay, if I see somebody that I know that needs a check-in, I'll just ask them, ping them real quickly. Hey, just checking in. What's your mental check-in? I learned this through, I think, Mental Awareness Month. Like people do this. And so I'm doing it slowly by myself. Like this is just an informal thing that I do, Danny, with like 2 people, 3 people. This is what we agreed upon, right? This is just a conversation we agreed upon, and it just kind of happened organically. We didn't force it, but that helped me kind of like right now in terms of burnout. My burnout level is low in the holidays because we kind of just talked about it. Like, hey, this is our expectations of what the team's going to do. So maybe that'll help you out, Danny, right? So just throwing ideas out.
No, that's super helpful. And I'm hoping that right now, like everything that's happening will, instead of employees going to their bosses, setting the boundaries, the top-down boundary setting needs to happen instead. And I'm hoping that we are part of Viva la Revolution, like something good's going to happen. But I mean, I worked with the majority of you people, me, I'm the most transparent person on the face of the earth. But I feel like management needs to do this, these mental check-ins. And if you're not comfortable telling me, find a coworker or someone else you're comfortable with, but where are your boundaries? What do you need? Because everyone needs to be managed differently and everyone needs different things. Some people want to work on the weekends because it's quiet time. And that's when they can get things done, or that's when their spouse isn't around, or like asking their employees, what do you need to prevent everything we're talking about now? And I have a feeling that this is going to start happening. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's hard when you're always speaking up from the bottom, because it's hard to be a part of change that way. Because like if you don't manage a team or you don't talk to the executive team on a regular basis, you can't be a part of that change. It's like you're complaining almost. And I feel like people even get burnout. They're like, why do I even complain anymore? And that's what I've noticed across my team, as well as people are like, it's not worth speaking up about it.
Well, I think there's a big difference between complaining and like talking about ideas about how to change company culture. You know, there's definitely a way to approach the conversation and say, you know, especially from a leadership point of view, like if I had an employee, I used to manage a team, and when COVID happened, we all became remote, and a lot of my team members were single parents and suddenly had kids at home who were, you know, trying to get their kids through school. So I remember sitting each of my employees down and being like, hey, I know you have a 12-year-old and a 5-year-old that you're trying to get through school. What do you need to move any meetings around so that you can facilitate getting them started on school? Like, tell me what you need. And I think that's important for leaders to do that, to have that conversation, right? Like you mentioned, Danny. But if they're not having that conversation, maybe they don't know how, or they don't know they need to. And it's okay for you to say, hey, I noticed there's a lot of people leaving and there's a lot of stress within the organization. I have this idea, X, Y, Z, of how we can help work together to like figure out a way around this, right? So when you present it as, you know, I'm seeing this is happening and I have an idea about how we can work together, then maybe it doesn't seem like complaining. Not that you're not doing it that way, just something that I've seen work before, where I've been in a similar situation where I had to like tell my leaders like, hey, we got to, you know, it's hard to enact change from the bottom, you know, of an organization. So just I would say don't lose hope and keep having those conversations, and just be careful about, you know, how you're having those, are cognizant of how, like, the way you're saying it, right?
I'm gonna, if I can jump on top of that, Danny, I can totally empathize with you. I work in higher ed for most of my life, and we are like a siloed system with stratification of power, you know, and you got to know your layer, you know, of where you are. So the corporate notion of managing up or having the opportunity to review my boss has given me reviews for 15 years. Not once have I been able to review my boss, you know, and so we don't really do that here. It's very, very, very top down. And so to feel like I had the psychological safety, especially as a young employee, to saber rattle or to just knock on someone's door and be like, hey, I think we could do this a different way. It's just not acceptable. You just don't do that. You know, even to this day, I'm at not executive level, but I'm kind of higher up now. And I have a seat at the table and I say, hey, I think we could do something different. They're like, yeah, no. Like, you haven't been around this long enough to say anything yet. And so I would just say, you know, to Jennifer's point, having the opportunity to speak to the right people in the right way at the right time is really I think the sweet spot to affecting change, culturally, especially.
We're already kind of dancing around this topic, and I'd love to just kind of dig into it in a more specific way. When you're talking about power dynamics of employees, employers, the culture of an organization, who's got the say, where does the responsibility divide, right? What is the responsibility of the employee as far as helping with burnout and diffusing their own burnout? What is the responsibility of management and leadership as far as diffusing and managing burnout?
I'm just going to jump in. I know I say too much, but I'm going to jump in anyway, because I think that the notion here is that, well, it's the employee's problem. Like, what they're not telling me what they need, right? And the fact is, it's not the employee's problem. It's an organizational problem. And the organization has to, if they're going to trickle down power, then they need to trickle down need as well. They need to have the ability or the willingness and to actually say to the employees, what do you need and how can I make your life better? Now, if you're going to flip that around and say, oh, we're an employee first organization, then fair enough. You've already set the stage for employees to knock on the door and say, hey, I think this needs to be different. But if that's not the way you're going to do it in an organization, then as organizational leaders, you must, if you're going to be top down, then you must also have those needs. There's an example that I read recently of a organization that like put a beach volleyball court or something on top of their roof of their organization. They thought, oh, people can have, you know, some recreation time. They can go up there and sit in the sand and play volleyball. And the employees are like, that's not what we need. We need like better technology or something. Why just spend all that money on so that it created animosity. And obviously the employees felt like nobody understands me, and they feel detached, and then that kind of piles up with well, then I'm just not going to ask because nobody's listening anymore. And then that whole thing just comes downhill into something nasty. So yeah, I just feel like it's an organizational problem.
Jennifer, Christina?
I think it's everyone's problem. I mean, I don't know. I feel like sometimes we take on too much, and it's not necessarily required, right? Like, I think it's really important to know what our limits are. And I don't know, I do this in my personal life. I have rules before saying yes to something. If it meets my rules and I have time, then I say yes. And then that's how I make sure that I don't overload my personal schedule and then I'm burnt out on Monday when I start work, right? But the same thing at work, especially, I work for a startup. We have a very small company. We all wear a lot of different hats. And it's easy to get caught up and say, oh, I'll take care of this and I can do that for you. And then suddenly you're not able to take care of your normal things because you're doing all these extra things, right? So I think it's just being self-aware of your time and what you do have the capacity to do, and speak, and having that safety, psychological safety, to speak up and say, hey, I don't have the bandwidth to do this right now. I'd love to help you, but I can't because it's going to impact XYZ, right? Like, I think it's just important to take a step back and take your ownership of that. Obviously, as leaders, we can tell when our employees or our team are getting burnt out, right? And if you notice someone else on your team is burnt out, asking them, are you doing okay? Is there something I can help with? If you have the capacity to help with it, I think that's really helpful. Speaking up and with whomever will listen when there is a problem, I think that's really important as well. But definitely leaders should be able to recognize when their team members are burnt out or when they need help, and then getting them the support that they need.
Well said.
Very
Right,
well said.
setting that environment for honest feedback, right? Like, you're not going to hurt anyone's feelings. We're looking for honesty here. I feel like that's a hard thing to find, because if you're on a call with the head of the department and the management level as well, not everyone is comfortable speaking up in that forum, or anonymous surveys, it's like the effort's there, but it's not personal. And you're talking about personal stuff like stress and anxiety and like crying, just having a day where you're like, I'm just having a bad day. It all builds up and everyone communicates about it differently and deals with it differently. Some people hit a breaking point, they go, and then they quit. And then other people speak up a lot, they get frustrated, or their work starts to suffer. So like, how, as not managing a team, how can you create that safe space with your coworkers who may be going through it, and finding out, what works for you? Like, how can I help you? Like, or this is a safe space. Like, anything you tell me, it stays here. We're not recording our internal call today. Because I feel like it always trickles out when you set that safe space. But if management could develop that as well, to where you're not going to say anything wrong here. You don't have to worry that I'm going to be disappointed or judge you, or like, I can't tell you how many times last year someone was like, I'm scared I'm going to get fired. I'm like, we're too busy. No one's going to fire you, even if you make a mistake. But recognizing, hey, are you making mistakes because you're too busy? You have too much on your plate. You're too stressed out. Those conversations aren't happening. So it's like being in a consultative, like a senior consultative level where I'm not managing a team. Like, how can you be a part of that positive change, or just maybe creating an environment of open communication to help prevent these scenarios?
It's not easy, Danny. I'll tell you, I manage 33 people right now. And for the last 10 years, whoever was leading them basically told them, without telling them, that if you speak out of turn, or you go against the grain, or you complain about something, then the hammer's coming down. So everybody hid in their little hole and just did their job. And I came on board and I started having conversations with people. I'm like, so you want to talk about it? They're like, can I? And I kept saying, yeah, you're good. We could just talk. Everything's cool, you know? And it took me 6 months to get people to actually start to believe me. Not even, I mean, and actually talk to me about things that were important, not just the surface level stuff, but the feelings, oh, I feel this and this kind of thing. It took me 6 months to get people to actually talk to me because of the buildup of that over time, So it's not easy. It's not easy, but it's important.
I think that's another thing to remember for leaders. Don't expect the change to happen just because you announce it. Don't expect, even if you are a better leader, you have to wait for that trust to build. And it's okay to have that patience and give yourself the patience, because otherwise you'll defy your own expectation and feel disappointed.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
We are running up to the edge of our time here on the webinar. I do want to thank everybody so much for your great questions, your great conversations. We do have a workbook we are coming out and publishing, just a couple of quick tips and helpful exercises as far as burnout goes. And we'll send that to everybody who has attended here and everybody who's registered. So please, thank you guys so much for joining. This is our first panel. We'll have many more, but thank you guys very much for your questions, for all of your comments, and thank you very much to our panelists, Jennifer, Sean, Christina.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank
Have
you,
a good rest
everyone.
of your day.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Bye, guys.